A psychoanalyst I know once told me that transitions are hard for her. I told her that Lacan says that love is giving something that you don't have to somebody who doesn't want it. And in the Laurie Anderson song, The Dream Before, Anderson related the story of Hansel and Gretel after they'd grown up. They were living in Berlin. She was a cocktail waitress, and he was an actor. He had a part in a Fassbinder film. Hansel told Gretel that he'd wasted his life on their stupid legend, and that his one and only love was a wicked witch. Then Anderson sang a paraphrase of Walter Benjamin's description of the Paul Klee painting, Angelus Novus. Hansel said, "History is an angel being blown backwards into the future." He said, "History is a pile of debris, and the angel wants to go back and fix things, to repair the things that have been broken. But there's a storm blowing from paradise, and the storm keeps blowing the angel backwards into the future. And this storm is called progress." I remember seeing a picture of my mother when she was in her mid-20s. I was maybe 5 years old when she showed me the picture in a photo album. One of those albums filled with plastic sheets where one side is sticky and the other is clean and slick. The photo was maybe in the top right-hand corner of the album, maybe off to the left. In the photo, printed on Kodak paper, my mother was standing next to Mickey Mouse, or more accurately, next to a man in a Mickey Mouse costume. Maybe Donald Duck was there too. I'm not sure, but in the photo, my mother was visibly pregnant with me, and she was at Disneyland. My father and mother had visited Walt's Kingdom before I was born, but they'd never, and never did, take me. Perhaps as some sort of compensation, I later dreamt that I could remember being in the womb. I either dreamt that I could remember being in the womb, or I actually did remember, only I remembered through a dream. If it was a memory, it was a kind of miracle in itself, but the truly strange thing about the memory was that I imagined that whilst I was in the womb, I could see Mickey Mouse. And Donald Duck too. I imagined I could see the men in their Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse costumes. Being a fetus, sloshing around inside the womb, I was so connected to my mother that I could see glimpses of the world that she saw. Through the umbilical cord, I had some sort of Ethernet connection to her optic nerve, and I could see flashes of the world she saw. GIFs maybe, repeating images. Mickey and then Donald, Donald and then Mickey. But despite this miracle, I have never visited Disneyland. I once knew a science fiction writer whose motto was, "If you're the smartest man in the room, leave the room." Despite this, he was the sort of person who clearly thought he was the smartest. And what exacerbated his egoism was the fact that he so often had smart things to say. I recall walking with him to Powell's Books in 2005 or so, showing him around my city when it was below freezing. He looked at me, shivering as we walked down the wet street, as we walked past the places where the brewery had once been, and he said, "You're very easy to manipulate. A perfect candidate for brainwashing." I was working on a novel called The Brainwash Brand, a book that was never really finished, and we'd been discussing how impressionable fans of writers were, and how would-be writers were easy to manipulate, and I'd been pretending that he wasn't talking about me. He told me that he'd met a great many writers. He'd met many writers who were just starting out, and they all had the same story, the same biography. They were all from upper middle class families, and they all explained their compulsion to write in basically the same way. It came down to intuition. They just knew that they were meant to be writers. They just knew that there was something about them as individuals that they needed to get out. They were, before they even started, important. As a working-class writer of Italian origin, this wasn't my colleague's story. I got the impression that he became a writer as an act of revenge. But my friend definitely had me pegged. And one of the reasons I intuited, that I should be some sort of celebrity, maybe an important novelist, was because I'd listened to Laurie Anderson's first album when I was 13 years old, and one of the tracks on that record was called Big Science, and that was the title of the album too. And the lyrics to that song included these lines. You know, I think we should put some mountains here. Otherwise, what are the characters going to fall off of? And what about stairs? Yodel-hee-hoo. In 1984, and at the age of 13, I was occupying that space between childhood and young adulthood that can be so difficult. I was what is now sometimes called a tween, which meant I still played with action figures or dolls. And I would listen to this song, and I would try to act out the absurd lyrics with my Luke Skywalker, or the Lone Ranger, or the $6 Million Man. And I would place my dolls throughout the living room, in a potted plant, or behind a stereo speaker, or on the windowsill, in the sun. Playing Anderson's Big Science, I would think about building spaces and finding places for my characters to fall off of. And I felt both powerful and protected. The world was both provisional and safe. We were all, and I was, looked after and free. Around that same time, I had nightmares. A year earlier, I'd gone to summer camp. I'd gone to the same summer camp that Jimmy Carter's daughters had gone to sometime in the 70s. And at this summer camp, along with the sons of dentists and stockbrokers and corporate lawyers, there was a Saudi prince. And I remember he told me that his grandfather had died that year and that he missed his grandfather. He told me that when he looked up at the sky and saw the stars, he knew his grandfather was up there, looking down on him. And I agreed that this was true. It was his religious belief, apparently, and I didn't want to be insensitive, not knowing anything about Islam or whatever. And I agreed because I'd heard a rumor that this Saudi prince had stabbed another boy with a Swiss Army knife. He was royalty, and nothing had been done about it. Another person I remember from summer camp was an assistant counselor named, I'll say Todd. Todd had a goatee, was an expert hiker with strong legs and strong arms, and he told me that I worried too much. I worried too much about who I was and who I'd be. I didn't need to worry, he told me, because it would all be over soon enough. There would be a nuclear war. It would all go down in flames. The whole human race would soon be obliterated. So why worry? Why worry? I remember looking up at the stars and wondering if there was maybe other life forms out there, or maybe there was a prince's grandfather. And I remember the campfire and the marshmallows, and I remember learning that we were all living on borrowed time, that our skin would soon be burned off, that we would all soon be sick from radiation. I was living at the end of the world. In 1995, Laurie Anderson released a CD-ROM game for Macintosh computers. Being a big fan of Laurie Anderson and owning a Macintosh computer, I ordered it directly from the game developer. It took several weeks for the game to arrive, longer than I'd been promised, and I ended up calling the company and demanding the game. They tried to tell me that something had gone wrong, that there was a mix-up, and that I would have to wait a little longer. But my memory is that I insisted that they deliver the game immediately, that night, or I would do something. I'm not sure what I threatened to do, if anything. Maybe write a letter to my congressman? In any case, I recall that the game did arrive at around 9 p.m. that night, delivered by hand to my door by a guy who looked like he might have also been a hat check clerk at an ice rink. Which, in fact, he turned out to be. Right. Again. Playing the game that night, with the lights off, immersing myself in it, I recall that it was spooky, surreal, somewhat disturbing, and quasi-spiritual. I also remember a segment of the game wherein you could click on a talking violin and Laurie would whisper to you.
Like that.
You know, I did an interview with John
noticed that he seemed to be such a happy guy. I mean, he was 80 years old. He was always smiling, and a lot of old people are in pretty bad moods by that point, but he wasn't. And I was supposed to be asking him about music and information theories, but what I really wanted to know was whether he thought things were getting better or worse. Because that was something that was really on my mind, but it seemed like such a stupid question that I was afraid to ask. So I talked around it for a while, sort of building up to it, and finally Gage said, exactly what are you trying to say? And I said, are things getting better or are they getting worse? And he only stopped for a moment and he said, oh, better. Things are getting better. I'm sure of that. We're getting smarter. It's just that it happens so slowly. That's all.
At the time, I found this message very soothing. Today, I reject it, and the Western Buddhism that Cage represents. But I still love this clip, and I'm still a fan of Laurie Anderson. I feel as though despite the trajectory of her career, from the alienating and critical early days to the soft-spoken and maybe partially New Age vision of her work today, that she is somebody who, when taken as a whole, still has something important to say to me. That even as a 21st century Marxist YouTuber who wants to ruthlessly critique every existing thing, there is something to her strange, disquieting optimism that I need to grasp. I recall that the other thing that Laurie Anderson would whisper when you clicked on her talking violin was this: I dreamt I was a dog in a dog show. And my father came to the dog show, and he said, look at the really good dog. I like that dog. It's common on the left to denigrate the self-help genre, but I believe that this is a genre Laurie Anderson's work belongs to. Her work is much better than Tony Robbins or Norman Vincent Peale's because it is so ambiguous and so strange. Most self-help gurus start with the presumption that you are you and that X equals X. But Anderson always suggests that we aren't who we believe ourselves to be. She suggests that we are becoming something, maybe something we don't really want to face. Most self-help gurus give advice, but Anderson only very rarely gives any hints or tips on how to live. And when she does advise, you're never really sure how literally to take her. My friend the psychoanalyst will sometimes read self-help books or Psychology Today articles, even though she knows how simple-minded and even misguided the advice from such publications can be. Still, when push comes to shove, or when the shove hits the fan, or when a shit sandwich arrives, and there's nothing to do but up, she'll sit down with a cup of tea or a glass of wine and read about love and loss. And she sometimes tells me what she's read. And I feel my job, when she does that, is to turn what she tells me upside down and create some healthy misunderstanding for her. Or maybe what I'm really doing is what she wants all her patients to do. Maybe I'm free associating on the sly, just to see how she interprets, and to find out what she'll charge me.
Hansel and Gretel are alive and well, and they're living in Berlin.
In a retrospective review of Big Science, an album which was based upon the first act from United States Live, critic Simon Broglia compared Anderson to the German Marxist intellectual Theodor Adorno. He suggested that through her art, Anderson achieved a critical distance from what I'll call modernity. He quoted the liner notes from Big Science, a passage wherein Anderson explained what she wanted to do. In 1982, Laurie Anderson said that her concert for United States Live was meant to create a portrayal of a civilization who invented the digital world and who now is going to learn to live in it. She explained that in the 70s, she'd performed her songs in Europe, where American culture was whistled and appreciated at the same time. And she wrote, "I've always heard that Europe considered the United States as its future." Should we consider Anderson's art as a reaction to or even a development of the Frankfurt School? Is she a critical theorist? Simon Broglia seems to think so. He sees a correlation between the critical distance towards Germany that Adorno achieved while in exile in the United States and the distance from America that Anderson achieved in the 70s. But I'm made uneasy by the conflation of their two quite distinct approaches to criticism and art. For example, Adorno was a congenital pessimist, and I imagine that he would be repulsed by the smiling optimism of Anderson, no matter how confounding and alienating that optimism might ultimately prove itself to be. And yet Anderson herself sees a connection. In 1995, she told Claudio Cianura that she and her New York contemporaries, Philip Glass and Patti Smith, for example, were pushed to learn from the protagonist of European antimodernism, for instance Walter Benjamin, to take an interest in non-Western cultures, such as the African one or the Far East ones, to continue the fight for the overcoming of the limits imposed to individual and expressive freedoms of the system. When I first read that last line, I misread it. I thought she'd written that she was pushed by antimodernism not to take an interest in non-Western culture, but to continue the fight for overcoming the limits of the West. And given how capitalism or modernity is now global, and even taking into account the alternative forms of capitalism or modernity, say Afrofuturism, the Asian model, contemporary Zionism, Islamic fundamentalism, and so on, it seems to me that we are already at the point where America has largely become our future, even if America is on the decline. And while one shouldn't underestimate the significance of what some might call the superstructure of society, isn't it the case that Marx has not only returned, but has already also been forgotten? So this turn back to a scene, to a sensibility, to the pose of critical distance, the appearance of thought, is it not itself a part of the forgetting that we've all started to willfully enact as we attempt to hide from our own failures? What am I really trying to say? What do I want to ask? Is Anderson's art good, or is it bad? Well, on the second track of the fifth side of Laurie Anderson's United States Live album, you'll find the song Democratic Way. Only it isn't really a song at all, but a spoken word piece. Laurie Anderson recites a dream that she'd had. A dream in which she was Jimmy Carter's lover. She was in the White House with lots of other women, and they were all supposed to be Jimmy Carter's lovers. But none of the women ever even saw Jimmy Carter. In the dream, the women were discussing Jimmy Carter's new plan to open up the U.S. presidential election to the dead. Anybody who had ever lived would be allowed to run for president, to become president. Jimmy Carter believed it would be more democratic that way, because the more choices the public had, the more democratic the country would be. What are we to make of this dream? If I was a psychoanalyst, how would I interpret it? Maybe it's worth noting that not all choices are liberating, and that laying out dead options on a menu or a sheet of cardboard doesn't really count toward increasing your options. Or maybe we can think about gender and what it might mean that Jimmy Carter, a man who confessed to Playboy magazine that he'd sinned in his heart and lusted after women who were not his wife, might be thought to require a harem before he can enact his bold plan. Or maybe the key fact is that the women in the harem never even saw Jimmy Carter. Maybe the key to understanding the dream is to realize that Jimmy Carter was absent from it. Another approach would be to consider the listener. What kind of person would enjoy listening to this short recounting of one of Laurie Anderson's dreams? What assumptions do we have to make to appreciate it as art, to find it funny, or both? We'd have to know who Jimmy Carter was, surely. But do we have to know that he'd once sinned in his heart? Do we have to be able to picture the interior of the White House? Where did you imagine the women were located? Did you see them in the Oval Office? Or on the set of Saturday Night Live? Maybe all criticism, all critical art, is destined to be recuperated, to be put into service of the world as it is, up until the point when such critical art is no longer necessary. In a documentary film about 4 composers that was produced in 1993, Laurie Anderson is one of the 4. A clip from a concert she was preparing to perform in Israel closes out her first segment, and in the clip, she describes watching the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall. She says that while she watched the images of East Berliners on American television, as she watched the expression on their faces, she found it was familiar. Theirs were the faces of eager shoppers. They couldn't wait to get to the stores in what was West Berlin. And she wanted to warn them, to shout to them to go back. And she wasn't sure if it was too early or too late. But then she says, anyway, they all looked so hopeful. Over the Christmas holiday of 2022, my parents visited me in Portland. 2 years out from the end of my marriage, the holiday was quite different than it had been in the past. We ate what for my family were traditional foods, sausage balls, ham, and asparagus. But the tree was a pink plastic job with fake snow and identical red and silver metal bulbs for decoration. The psychoanalyst I know stopped by to celebrate with us, and she and I, along with my parents and 3 of my children, watched My Man Godfrey on the Criterion Channel. We watched Carol Lombard pursue William Powell. We watched Lombard faint into Powell's arms. She was trying to give him something she didn't have. At one point that Christmas, I found myself in a deep discussion with this psychoanalyst. I don't remember what we were talking about, but only that our conversation emerged while we were sitting at the dinner table, as my children and parents were all competing to be heard above the overall clamor. My family, such as it remains, was trying to get my attention. They all took turns calling my name, but I didn't answer them, not right away. The day before, on Christmas Eve, my youngest son and I had had dinner with his grandparents, with my parents. During the car ride back, my son mentioned the time he'd taken a trip with my parents, a trip to Disneyland. He'd gone with them and his 3 other siblings. They had enjoyed the trip, even though the lines had been long and the day had been exhausting. I piped up that I still somewhat resented that my parents had gone to Disneyland before I was born, but had never taken me as a child. And I was told that they had not traveled to Disneyland before I was born. My mother had never visited Disneyland at all, not until she went with her grandchildren in 2010. I objected, telling her I remembered a photograph of her with Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, or rather with men in Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck costumes. And she said that no such photograph existed. She told me that she'd been to Elitch Gardens when she was pregnant with me, but not to Disneyland. And when I tried to explain my dream about being in her womb, tried to inform them all about my secret conviction that I'd seen Mickey Mouse while I was still a fetus, I was interrupted, and the conversation moved on to other topics. Were my son's sideburns really stylish, my mother wondered, or was he making a terrible fashion mistake? Laurie Anderson once asked the musician and Fluxus artist John Cage if things were getting better or getting worse. He answered, they're getting better. On her album, Bright Red, Laurie Anderson asked the question again, this time to the listener. She said, and what I really want to know is, are things getting better or are they getting worse? Then she said, stop, stop, pause, pause, or in record. Because these stories that we have remembered, and most of them never even get written down. And so when they say things like, we're going to do this by the book, you have to ask, what book? Because it would make a big difference if it was Dostoevsky or just, Ivanhoe.